To begin looking now at chapter 10. This will be, again, a very brief look at the chapter because there's a lot of the things that we will absolutely go over in class. Like, for example, as we get started here, what you see is what's called a caricature. All right. A caricature is maybe a slightly perceived um, understanding of who somebody is, especially when it comes to candidates here. Typically, what we see in campaigns and elections is we typically see the caricatures of these characters being portrayed in these commercials and in these campaign um, flyers and slogans and Facebook posts and things of this nature. We will actually look in class at a number of these um, campaign ads from Hillary Clinton, from Barack Obama, from John McCain, from lots and lots of elections in American history, and even that from Donald Trump that we see here, and we may even pull out a few from this most recent election here with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and again. These types of images, these types of things are frequently overemphasizing certain aspects of one of these candidates' character or voting record or something of this nature. All right. And you'll also need to understand here that campaigns can be a very passionate exercise. And it frequently is one of those things that in a given election year, we find ourselves very polarized during such times, and never more than what we are right now. And so, again, people get pretty fired up about their candidates, one way or the other. And if you see somebody that's pretty fired up about somebody that you are very much against, it will frequently cause you to be angry, maybe lose friendships, or at least drop them as a friend on your social media and things like this. I encourage you to be a little bit better than maybe what you've witnessed in our country, even among adults and things like that, than that. But as we get into this, what do you have to do in a campaign? There's a lot of challenges, and you see them listed here from campaign financing, which is going to be a huge one. Campaigns are ridiculously expensive the way they're run now, and essentially, here's the real frustrating thing. Essentially, what we see is that those that have the most money can really control the campaigns and the way they go, and it's not overstating the fact that in the majority of cases, the candidate that raises the most money wins. That's not a very democratic sounding thing. Matter of fact, it's one of those things that turns younger voters off. That how effective can I be? How valuable is my participation? When the more money you have, the more likely you are to have any kind of effect on this thing. And so, campaign finance and campaign finance reform is one of the things you're going to be hearing about for a long time. We'll be talking about individual contributions, which cannot be more than $2,700 per candidate per election cycle, every 2 year cycle, whatever it is. We got PAC contributions, and we'll talk about what a PAC is, and we'll talk about PACs over and over and over again in this chapter. We'll talk about party contributions, and we'll talk about personal contributions, handling the press, the debates, and news media to some degree, at least in this chapter. All right. So let's get into this. Let's look and see here how I'm going to have to move that thing to where it's not going to be bothering me at all times. How funds are spent. All right, here's the way this is going to look. Your sources of funds here, we've got $7.5 million over here, $7.5 million. Right. This can be very, very complicated with everything from the way it's going to be spent on TV and radio advertising, internet sites, legal accounting fees, print media, polling, canvassing, fundraising, office rent and equipment, travel, staff salaries, et cetera, et cetera. Or it can be a slightly little bit more simple when we look at how this money arrived. Where did that $7.5 million come from? It came from 67% came from individuals. $75,000 or 1% came from a candidate's own money. A political party contributed another 6%, and PACs contributed about 26%. The one thing that's pretty regulated is how much an individual can give, but again, that is a good portion of the pie of how this is going to end up being spent over here in this other chart, right? But it's this 26% that is given by PACs that typically ends up being pretty controversial. All right. Um, what do we see here? I'm going to drag this thing all over the place the whole lecture apparently. Growth in total contributions by PACs to House and Senate candidates, and this runs from 72 to 2000. You can kind of see what's basically happened is that money given by PACs has only increased all the time and to a huge, huge degree. So let's get to your first test question. The majority of political action committees, otherwise known as PACs, represent who? And the answer to that is that they represent business and professional groups. Business and professional groups. And essentially, when we get to chapter 11, you're going to see that interest groups are very, very powerful, powerful entities. It's difficult to overstate the case on how important, how powerful, and in some cases, how corrupt interest groups can be because they get to use their money in slightly dubious ways. And one of the favorite ways that they like to use that money is using PACs. And instead of all that money being routed and given to a single candidate, what they do is they have a PAC that strategically allocates that money to specific campaigns and specific elections that are going to be extremely important for the agenda that that particular interest group might serve. And so when we talk here about PACs, they typically represent business and professional groups. All right. Let me see here. The basic structure of American political parties. And we look down here to the bottom, we see party identifiers and voters, up to party activists and volunteers, up to precinct and ward committees, to city and county committees. And this kind of goes right over to the previous chapter as we were talking about these things. But then at the state level, we see it fold over into congressional district committees, state central committees, and state conventions. And finally, at the national level, to the party's national chairpersons and the party's national committee. And finally, the quadrennial national convention, which is a huge thing every time they have this thing. All right. Let's continue to crack along here. Political party finances. How's this money used? Amount in millions as it's being spent over here in the left column. Party contributions to and expenditures for candidates, and then here is your bottom axis, which would be the year. And notice what's happening here is that generally speaking, Republicans are outspending Democrats. You see a couple spots where that is a slightly different number, but generally speaking, that is kind of a trend. How much is actually needed? Let's imagine right now that we're talking. This is a test question. How much is needed for a candidate to have a reasonable chance of winning a seat in the House of Representatives? Okay. How much is needed for a candidate to win a seat in the House of Representatives? And the answer to that is essentially going to be about $1 million. It'll take about $1 million raised for any one representative have a chance at winning a seat in the House of Representatives. I mean, $1 million. These, and you can imagine that it's only going to go up from there at the federal level. Okay, a Senate seat is going to be more expensive, and then obviously, if we get to presidential campaign elections, holy cow, that's a huge, huge expenditure of money. And again, there's a reason why there's a constant discussion of a need for such things. Okay. Let's go. Methods of selecting presidential delegates. Okay, bear in mind we have this thing called the Electoral College. We have the convention system and everything like that. We have primary systems, which include closed and open, and then caucuses. And we can kind of look here on the map and see how that plays out, right? So if you look in the purple, for example, which does include the state of Oklahoma, we have a closed primary. Now, what that means is that in a closed primary, if you are registered as a Democrat, you can only vote in the Democrat primary. If you are registered as a Republican, you can only vote in the Republican primaries. You cannot vote if there is not if you are not registered for that party's primary. So you see the other options we have here would be an open primary, which means you can only vote once, but you can choose which party's primary you want to vote in. So you can be registered as a Democrat and vote in a Republican primary. And it's there where we start to see strategic voting that takes place. And it's a very flawed system. We'll watch a couple CGP Grey videos that will help with this, but I mean, really, if you engage in strategic voting, let's imagine that you're in the state of Arkansas, just to our east, right? And your party, if you're a Democrat, let's say, your party is the incumbent, which means they have the one in office, but there's going to be a primary for the Republican candidates. You can go and vote in that Republican primary, and what you're likely to do is to engage in strategic voting. Which one of those individuals would you either A, most likely like to see run, or which one do you think would be more defeatable when it comes to running against the person that you're really going to vote for in the actual general election, right? And so the primary systems are going to matter. And then the final system you see here would be what's called caucuses. And honestly, this is kind of it's a weird thing to even think about. And again, we'll watch videos on this in class, but a caucus basically in your local precinct, what you're going to do is you're going to go into one room, and everybody goes in there together, and they're going to have some speeches and things like that. But then when the voting time comes, all the people that want to vote for this person will stand in this area of the room, and all the people that want to vote for this person will stand in this area of the room, and there'll be some more discussion, and they'll move back and forth and everything like that. But these caucuses, it is an interesting process to consider. Again, we have primary voting and we have a closed primary where we're at. So let's get to a test question. Party activists who are elected to vote at a party's national convention are called what? And the answer to that is delegates. Okay, they are called delegates. Party activists who are elected to vote at a party's national convention are called delegates. And so essentially, the delegates from the state of Oklahoma, if let's say we're talking about a presidential election here, and we're talking about the 2020 election, Donald Trump won. And so, therefore, all of those delegates will be sent from Oklahoma to the national convention, and they will cast Oklahoma's votes all for Donald Trump. All right. And then at the end of that convention, they'll declare who the runner is going to be for that particular party. Right. Let's keep moving. States drawn in proportion to their electoral college votes. What should we see? Well, number one, you should notice that in comparison to other states, Oklahoma is a pretty average sized state. Okay. We see that there are some huge ones like California that has 54 electoral college votes, or Texas that has 32, Illinois that has 22, Ohio 21, Pennsylvania 23, Florida 25, New York at 33. But then there's others that have very few electoral college votes, such as Wyoming, both Dakotas, Montana, Alaska. They only have 3. And how do you come up with that? Well, you are allotted the amount of electoral college votes for the amount of representatives in the House of Representatives, plus the amount of representatives you have in the Senate. Since every state has 2, you know that automatically every state's going to have those 2. Plus, if they're a small enough state that they only have 1 representative from their state in the House of Representatives, you have a total of 3. So the smallest amount you could possibly have would be 3. And you'll notice the amount of states that only have the 3 representatives. And we see Delaware and District of Columbia and Vermont that also have a very, very small number of electoral college votes. All right. I can skip some stuff here. Voter turnout in presidential and midterm elections. Well, first off, let's get to the test question because I think that will be helpful in understanding what's happening right now, right? What is a midterm election? During midterm elections, voters are selecting what? And the answer to that is they're selecting members of Congress. If you remember from earlier chapters, all of the members of the House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years. Members of the Senate are up for election every 6 years. So that means every 2 years, 1/3 of them will be up for election. And presidents are elected every 4 years. So because we have to have an election every 2 years, we see that 1/3 of the Senate and all of the members of the House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years. So during that midterm election, we're voting on members of Congress. But what happens here? Well, during midterm elections, we see a drop in voter turnout. There's a selection of voters that really only participate during presidential elections. That's the only time they ever really get excited or get involved in things like that. Frequently, the midterm elections, they just don't have as much, and pardon the phrase here, but they just don't have as much sex appeal. You don't have these huge candidates that have all these commercials that are running for president of the United States, because we view the president of the United States to be way more important than it really is. And so, therefore, in people's perception, if there's not a president that's up for election, they're just not going to participate. All right. Let's skip that around here. Let's skip that too. We did talk about that in the last chapter. Let's talk about three elections. Election of 1800. Why is it important? Well, bear in mind, Washington served 1892 to 1896, and then from 1792 to 1796, and then from 1796 to 1800. And so I'm still back. I'm still off. 1788 to 1792, and 1792 to 1796. And then from 1796 to 1800, you're going to have John Adams, who is the president of the United States. Bear in mind, George Washington was not somebody who was a part of a political party. And so the first time we have to transfer power from one party to the other is in the election of 1800. And so that is going to be a pretty important thing. In that election, there were no primaries, there were no conventions, no speeches given. It's a time of very little travel. And so you see that that's just kind of the way things were. Newspapers were very partisan. What we mean by that is that they were not, despite the way we like to think, they were not an unbiased group. Newspapers were frequently owned by the political parties, and so they were very biased in their approaches as well. The campaigns focused on state legislatures because they were the ones that end up choosing the electoral college, and so that those end up being very important things. It was a peaceful transfer of power, and that's an important thing in American history as well. Let's look at another one. In 1896, this is a bitter fight over economic interest. This is the campaign we frequently talk about between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley. The Democrats' main issue is the Democrats were kind of swallowing the populist movement at the time, which is William Jennings Bryan, and their issue was the unlimited coinage of silver. He Bryan ends up winning the nomination with his speeches about the virtues of silver. There's a famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech, and it played a major role. But who ends up winning is actually William McKinley. Republicans end up winning that election there with McKinley. McKinley will go on, will enter a war that Bryan in a million years would not have entered. McKinley didn't even want to enter the Spanish-American War in 1898. But this is absolutely going to be a very, very consequential election, and there is an argument to be made, as we've talked about before, that the powers that be, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, they're the ones that end up winning that election because they literally bought and paid for that election. They bought and paid for William McKinley, even if William McKinley wasn't necessarily a party to it. Or let's look at another one. In 2000, all right, I know that this is an election that's before your lifetimes, which is a crazy thing for me to even think about, but the election of 2000 was a stinking mess. We had no clear winner. The one that had won the popular vote is not the one that ended up winning. Al Gore would still tell you that he should have been the president of the United States. He's still whining about that thing. No clear winner. It ends up in the House of Representatives. No clear winner ends up being decided by the Supreme Court of the United States in a decision called Bush v. Gore, in which they end up choosing the President of the United States and choosing George W. Bush to be the President of the United States. It was a difficult situation. What caused it really was the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, there was a lot of confusion because the ballots were, quite honestly, kind of dubious. They were kind of difficult to really, and especially since there's that many old people in Florida, if you just don't know the stereotypes, they could not see the difference between who they were voting for on these ballots. And so they had recount after recount after recount, and ended up having Bush win every one of those recounts. But essentially, it ended up being the United States Supreme Court that let him win. All right. Um, let's talk here about nominations for a second. During the nomination process, we have the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus. These are two very important things when it comes to presidential elections. And in the perception of the way it all plays, Iowa and New Hampshire's, they're very, very, very important. It's the first time we really see how anybody in the country is really starting to feel. We start to get some real data on this. We start to see how accurate our polling has been. Um, holy crap. Anyways, why? Well, let's look into some of these battleground states. And again, you'll see New Hampshire and Iowa, they figure heavily, but also Ohio, Georgia, Florida. These are considered battleground states. Test question here. A state with a roughly equal number of Democrats and Republicans in the population is often referred to as what? And the answer is a battleground state. The roughly equal Democrats and Republicans. And so there's never a real clear idea of who will win. And so those battleground states loom large when it comes to general elections. Let's talk about the effects of the Electoral College. There's a huge movement to get rid of the Electoral College. So, how does this play out for us? Well, let's look at weights. Okay. In California, we see that they have a population of about 33.8 mil, and they get 54 electoral votes. Right. Their weight per elector, okay, residents per elector, is a weight of 0.83. Right. So if you divide the population by the amount of electoral votes they get, essentially every person who votes is actually only worth 0.83 of a vote. You see that? Let's look at some other states like North Carolina. North Carolina, you have a population about 8 mil. They get 14 electoral votes. So what is the weight? Quit that. What is the weight of the resident to elector value there? And it is essentially 0.91. So we get closer to a 1-to-1 ratio. If you look at the state of Oklahoma, we are actually one of the very closest to a 1-to-1 ratio. But even Oklahomans' votes are only worth 0.96. So what does it mean? Well, let's look at Alaska so you can tell what we're talking about right now. Well, you're guaranteed to have 2 electors because every state has 2 senators, and you're guaranteed to have at least 1 representative. So let's imagine you have an extremely small population like Alaska. You have 626,000 voters and 3 electors, right? That comes up to a weight of about 2.5. Every person who votes in the state of Alaska is actually worth 2.5 votes in the overall national election. By the time you add the entire United States together, the United States is a 1-to-1 ratio, but the individual states are actually not. States like Alaska and South Dakota and North Dakota and Wyoming and Vermont and Delaware, they are states who have a higher weight per person than all the other states. It's making sense to you. So let's just consider here for a second, all right? I think I've got the wrong one there. Okay. All right. We're good. Let's get to midterm elections. All right. We've talked about what those are. I think I can skip that. Open primary, closed primary. We defined a while ago, but an open primary, a voter can wait until the day of the primary to choose which party to enroll in to select candidates for the general election, or in a closed primary, a primary in which voters can participate in the selection of candidates for a party to which they belong prior to the election itself. Right. So essentially, if you're in an open primary state, you can choose which of the primaries you're going to participate in. If you're in a closed primary state, you can only participate with that primary that you're already a member of that party. Right. We have a couple other elements here that you can find in your textbook, so I'm not going to spend any time on them. We will talk about these things as well, but let's look here. Majority systems is a candidate must receive a majority or 50% plus one of the votes in a district in order to win a seat. A plurality system, though, like most elections in the United States, candidates need only receive the most votes in an election, regardless of whether it constitutes a majority. So if you have more than two people that are running for any particular seat, a person can win without actually having a majority of the votes. We have a plurality system. So whatever candidate gets the most votes overall is going to be the one that wins. And that will play a role, and you'll see what we mean as we get into class and talk about those things as well. There is another thing called proportional representation. Some electoral systems use proportional representation system, which multiple seats are awarded for a particular geographic area, and each party receives a percentage of those seats proportional to the percentage of votes it received. Let me break that down for you. Let's imagine that in Oklahoma, our 7 electoral votes, let's imagine that we had a proportional system in the state of Oklahoma. So we have a primary, we have all this stuff, but then we have the general election, whatever. What's going to happen is that the electors from the state of Oklahoma, if we did a proportional representation system, the electors, let's imagine right now that there are 25% of the people of Oklahoma that are going to come in and they're going to vote for, let's say in this last election, that 25% of Oklahoma voted Joe Biden. We would send 25% of our electors for Joe Biden, and the other 75% would have went for Donald Trump. But what we have is a winner-take-all system in which whoever wins, all of those electors from that state go and they're going to cast their vote for Donald Trump in this particular case, like it was for Oklahoma. A proportional representation system would probably be better, more accurate to the general amount of people, and it would. Yeah. So here we go. Majority, plurality, proportional representation systems. Let's talk about districting and redistricting. Okay. Redistricting is a process. So, I already skipped one. That's what it did. That's what it was. Okay. Let me give you a few test questions real quick. Number one, a major cause of political polarization in Congress is what? And the answer to that is gerrymandering. Okay. It's a major cause of political polarization in Congress. It's called gerrymandering. All right. And then number two, if a citizen votes for a Republican for president and a Democrat for senator, he or she has engaged in what? All right. And the answer to that is split ticket voting. All right. Split ticket voting. And then finally, we have the boundaries of legislative districts in the United States are to be redrawn every how many years? Okay. And the answer to that is 10 years. Every year ending in 0, we do a redistricting process. And that's going to be the way all of this whole situation plays out. And that's what causes the gerrymandering that we're going to be talking about. So let's talk here a little bit about what that looks like. This is a district in Chicago. You can imagine Chicago, very, very, very populous area, one of the biggest cities in our country. This is one person's district, right? Now, you would think that they would just kind of draw this thing blindly and say, okay, this amount of people would be that amount of residents, and so that would be your district. But that's not the way this is drawn. When you literally carve out the people that you want in your district like this, and which you're literally just grabbing neighborhoods and bringing them into your district, this is a very specifically drawn district for Chicago. Okay. This particular district is 100% guaranteed to elect a black person to office. Don't take that the wrong way, because quite honestly, gerrymandering, even though this district is absolutely going to elect somebody of a specific race, because if they're coming from here, they're likely of a specific race. That does not mean that it's something that's cheating for that people group. because what they're essentially doing is eliminating the power, and you'll see what we mean by that through a couple of videos. It's a difficult thing to do, but essentially what they're doing is they're trying to group as many of the people of the same kind together into one district, while putting a more wide, diverse group in the other districts, which is going to let the other party win more seats than this one party would get. All right, I know that's probably clear as mud, but to show you, that's just not a very clear picture. This is in North Carolina. This is one person's district in North Carolina. This does not look at all like a sensible way to draw a district. All right, because that district has been gerrymandered. This is what the districts look like in the state of Oklahoma. We see District 1 is right over here in the Osage County area. Okay. We see that also includes Tulsa. We see that the eastern half of the United States, or I'm sorry, the eastern half of Oklahoma is in District 2. The western portion is District 3. You get District 4 down here in the south, and you get Oklahoma City as District 5. So again, you can kind of see the way we draw these things out. Ballots. Very structure of an election ballot can sometimes have profound effects on electoral outcomes. The first, flawed balloting systems, variations from one voting district to the next, can advantage some voters over others. And if you look throughout American history, the way ballots have been drawn, it's been various. In some cases, if you were going to vote Republican, you had to go get a Republican ballot. If you're going to vote Democrat, you had to go get a Democrat ballot. We now see that they're all together and everything, but the way that those things are drawn can sometimes have an effect, like what we saw in the election of 2000 with the state of Florida. Let me see what's going on. Electoral college we've talked about. Let's get into this. Let's get to a test question real quick. What is an incumbent? Okay, what is an incumbent? The answer to that is that the incumbent is the candidate or the current office holder that is running for re-election. Who wins these elections? Well, essentially, one of the biggest advantages you can have is to be the incumbent. The person that's running for re-election has a record that they can run on. They have name recognition because they've already at least won one election. If you're the one trying to fight against them and get a seat from somebody, you have a much lesser likelihood of actually winning. Incumbent advantage is huge in this country. All right. Here, what's another test question? When does public opinion polling take place during a campaign? And the answer to that is it takes place throughout the entire campaign. They are going to try to gauge public opinion throughout the entire campaign to know what's happening, what's causing people's minds to be changed, what's shifting in the numbers and everything like that. So polling is not something that takes place early or late. It's something that takes place at all times throughout a campaign. All right. How voters decide, they end up voting along partisan loyalty, along issues, and sometimes about candidate characteristics, and even more so in recent days. And the last little section of our lecture today is going to be money and politics. Money and politics. As contemporary election campaigns have come to rely more on media, polls, and other capital intensive means of reaching voters, candidates and their campaigns increasingly rely on donors. Okay. Money is always going to matter. So let's talk about this. Individual donors largely contribute based on issues and ideology, whereas professional givers, like political action committees that we've already talked about, often donate money to campaigns to advance their cause and gain access to political office holders. So let's get to a good test question, all right? An individual citizen can give no more than $2,700 per candidate for federal office per election in a given 2-year cycle. Test question. A citizen can currently give no more than how much per candidate for federal office per election in a given 2-year cycle? The answer is $2,700. All right. Let's talk about some other things. When it comes to soft money, in recent years, campaign finance reforms have sought to reduce the impact of money and fundraising on political campaigns. So, what do we see now? We get to soft money. For example, the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act sought to reduce the amount of soft money contributions to political parties. And this comes from organizations, individuals, businesses, things like that. And we also get to what's called dark money. And dark money comes from 501c4s, which is, by the way, a test question. 527 committees. Okay. There are still critics that charge that the BCRA led to an increase in the influence of independent 527 committees that funnel large amounts of money into elections through issue advocacy ads, but are less accountable than political parties. So let's imagine right now that instead of you giving money to a candidate, are you legally allowed to pay for a campaign ad that only talks about an issue without necessarily talking about an individual? And then letting those things kind of go. There's a reason why when you hear these campaign ads, it says that this ad was approved by this person, whatever, right? Or my name is Hillary Clinton and I approve this message and things of this nature. But there's also other kinds of ads that are attack ads, not necessarily run by that person's campaign. And so that's where we get a lot of the expenditure of some of this weird money that comes in here, right? What is a 527 committee? This is a test question. They're independent nonprofit groups that receive and distribute funds to influence the nomination, election, and or defeat of a candidate. A 527 committee is an independent nonprofit group that receives and distributes funds to influence the nomination, election, and or defeat of a committee. All right, or I'm sorry, of a candidate. That's, I think, all for now, and that should finish up this section of chapters. We'll get to chapter 11 in short order, probably next week.